Hi there. As I was getting to know the Electribe, I found quite a few features that were either not documented, hidden, and certainly not obvious from the user interface. Here they are. The part mute button lets you mute different parts in your track. But if you double tap it, it starts blinking, and then you can solo tracks. You can also hit a few buttons at the same time and solo multiple tracks at the same time. On to tip number 2. You can learn a lot from the factory patterns that are provided with the Electribe. But if you keep part mute on and scroll through the different patterns, you'll see that a lot of parts are muted by default. For example, in this pattern, most of the parts are muted. Just go ahead and unmute them, and you can learn a lot more about the track and about how to create different interesting parts within the Electribe. On to tip number 3. The trigger button lets you preview the different parts in a pattern. And that's great, but there's another way to use it. There's a setting deep in the menus in Global Parameters Trigger Mode called Sequence Play. And once you turn that on, the pads work completely differently in trigger mode. Each pad either triggers the whole part, or if you press it briefly, lets you play one-shots with the sounds. And once you're done playing this way, you can always hit the play button, and the pattern will continue as planned. As I said before, you can learn a lot from the patterns provided by Korg. For example, in this pattern, whatever's going on in part 5 is particularly interesting to me. So if you want to find out what the filter or synth settings are without touching the knobs, because sometimes when you touch them you can change things dramatically, just hit the left and right buttons to cycle through the different parameters. That way you can learn which filters are on, which effects are on, and so on. Sometimes Korg has gone on and done some pretty crazy things in individual steps in a pattern. There's a little trick that lets you preview every single step by pressing the pads. What you need to do is go to the menu, go to Step Edit, and then hit the right button. And now the pads become active, and you can preview every single step. Go to the sequence you want, and then just hit the pads to see what each one of them does. By the way, step edit mode is a little bit intimidating, but I recommend learning it if you have the time. On to tip number 6. The shift button is a really great way to get things done quickly. Each of the pads with a shift button represents a shortcut. The problem is that's not written anywhere but the manual. So I recommend getting an overlay. This one is by Crema Cafe. It comes with a yellow background. It's a little bit easier to use if you remove the yellow background. That way it's not doesn't stick out as much. But in any event, whether you buy this or create something on your own, I highly recommend getting this or something like it because it's completely not obvious what shift and each of the pads does. And this will save you a lot of menu surfing. Besides using shift in the pads, a little bit more obvious is shift and some of the other buttons. For example, shift and tap tempo for setting the BPM, shift and master effects for setting the effects, shift and gate arp for setting the gate arp mode, shift and chord for setting the chord set number, which brings us to tip number 8, chord set. What this does is add an extra note to the chord you're playing in chord mode. And the nice thing is that this works differently in different scales. So play around with it, change the scales around, and you'll get completely different sounds. Which brings us to tip 9. I was pretty frustrated when chords didn't work for all parts. Some they worked great, but then for other parts they just wouldn't work. And this is because if a part is set to mono mode, chords won't play. So go to the menu, find the part setting for polyphony, which for some reason is called voice assign. So go ahead and look for that. And once you've found it, turn the knob and turn on either poly 1 or poly 2, and you'll be good to go. Another hidden feature is a shortcut for selecting parts. Now you can use the left and right buttons to move from part to part, but a quicker way is to hold down either the sequencer, keyboard, or chord buttons, hit the part you want, and that will shift right to it. This next one is a pretty odd one. If you put the XY pad in Gate Arp mode, and then hit one or more keys and quickly tap the pad, preferably on the left side, it's going to remember whatever you pressed and become a shortcut for the group of pads you were holding while you pressed the pad. And this works in other modes, for chords, for example, or in part mute mode for muting one or more parts, turning them on and off quickly. This works for any number of parts. You can also do this in step jump mode. Pick the parts, hit the pad, and then you can toggle them just by touching the pad again. This next tip is more about a feature that I tend to forget about, which is Gate Arp types. Don't get stuck with Gate Arp 1, explore different ones. You can use it for fills, or with touch scale for interesting arpeggios, and you can record whatever you create here. I recommend exploring it. Tip number 13. The pads are pressure sensitive, they're just not shipped that way by default. To enable pressure sensitivity, press Shift and the shortcut pad. That will quickly let you set the trigger pad velocity setting to on. You can turn this on quickly for all the pads by cycling left and right using the part buttons and quickly turning on every one of the settings for every one of the pads. And now your pads are pressure sensitive. Changing octaves is another feature that isn't labeled anywhere on the device, but once you're in keyboard or chord mode, the part buttons let you go up and down octaves. And you can go more than 4 up or down. The LED starts blinking on the edges, and the numbers 2 and 3 get you quickly to the middle octaves. On to tip 15. While the Gate Arp button will let you arpeggiate over time, it doesn't really let you arpeggiate up and down a chord. And the nice way to do that is by creating short length parts using the last step feature. Last step lets you shorten a part to anywhere between 1 to 15 and of course 16 steps. Create a short part and you've created an arpeggiator. If you want to have some fun with this, you can change the last step even after you've recorded the pattern that you're playing. So in this case, I can shorten it to 3 steps. Changing this during playback, even back to 4, can produce some interesting results. On to tip 16. Once you've created a bar that you like, if you want to copy it to 4 bars, just change the pattern length from 1 to 4, or to 2 or 3 or any number of bars that you want. And now your bar has been copied across all 4 bars. If you want to undo this and start again, clear the sequence first. Start with 1 bar and expand to 4. On to tip 17. Grooves are a really cool feature of the Electribe, and it's one of those things that if you haven't tried out, you really should. Now the first thing you need to do is go to groove depth and increase it. Otherwise, setting the groove type won't work. And as you can hear, a simple repetitive hi-hat pattern all of a sudden becomes a lot more interesting. The first set of groove types only change the velocity of the beats in a part, and the higher groove types also take notes off the beat. The nice thing about grooves as opposed to swing is that they work on a per part basis, not across the whole pattern. Tip 18 is about menu organization. The menus on the Electribe can be a little bit overwhelming because there are 28 different items. So it's easier if you think of it broken down into sections. Items 1 to 15 are about patterns, 16 to 23 about parts, and the rest are miscellaneous. And the shortcuts are arranged in the same way. The first shortcuts are for patterns, the rest are for parts, and then miscellaneous. Tip number 19 is about sneaking an extra beat in. The Electribe automatically quantizes everything to 16 beats per bar. But if every now and then you're playing at a slow tempo and need an extra beat here and there, you can use delays or effect 22, the roller effect, to get a few more notes in.